All right, there is something in C# known as a nullable type. And so sometimes you need to create a variable, int my number, and you want that variable to have a value which is outside of a range that you would normally test against. So if you are, say, keeping track of a budget and you store this into an int, normally you may set this equal to some negative value high enough to, or low enough to where your budget may not encounter negative $1 million or something like that, which $1 million if you're a business, that could be very doable. So maybe you would want to use a long. And so then you have something that you can go even lower. But that's not always possible. Sometimes you may need to actually have a variable which doesn't have any value whatsoever that you can check to see, hey, does this variable not have a value? And so in C#, there's this thing known as a nullable. So you can say, instead of int my number, you can say nullable less than the type my number is equal to null. And so now this will create a variable called my number, assign it the value null there, and I can also now say my number is equal to 42. Because it is an int type, it does now have the value null that could be assigned. So we can have a conditional saying that if my number is null, then do something else. Otherwise, well, we have some value which has been put in there. Really important when dealing with databases, because databases, it's very common to have null values in certain fields, and when you're reading it in, you may want to read in all of the data and keep track of what is null and what is not null and still store that there. So this nullable here, it's a struct nullable. You have this t there, which is the type that is actually going to be there, and that's a parameter for it. This will work for most of the variables out there. We could say nullable decimal. And notice that I can still set that variable to a value. But, I mean, programmers are lazy. I'm lazy. I don't want to have to type nullable decimal out there. So they came up with a shorthand. So I could say int question mark. And now that will effectively do the same. I'm going to go ahead and leave this up here. Nullable my number is equal to null. These two lines are equivalent. So you could type out nullable with the type there, or you can just say int question mark. And again, we can still say my number is equal to 42, and that will work just the same. This is a shorthand way of saying we're going to set this variable, we're going to create an int, but one of the values that you can have in there is null. So there is a something you can do. You can do console.writeLine my number dot. Notice that there is now a value and a has value. So if I go ahead and comment this out, and if I just say int my number, and I say console.writeLine my number dot, notice there is no value and has value. Once it becomes a nullable type, then it adds in that value and has value. Go back here, dot, and so if I say has value and run this, this will print out a Boolean of true or false. Run this. Notice that now it has a value, 42, hence we're getting a true. Whereas if I do not set that and it is just set to null, this is going to print out has value will print out false. So again, you can do this in a conditional, And you can actually print out the value there. Now in this case, we're going to get a error, an unhandled exception. Nullable object must have a value. So normally what you do is you would check, does it have a value? If it does, then do stuff with that value by accessing .value, or you can just access the variable itself. If I uncomment that out and I do myNumber.value, notice I get 42 out to the screen. So this is a nullable variable there. We can do stuff with string, question mark. And now instead of putting a number there, we can say this is now a string. And so this doesn't actually have the has value and everything, but it does have a length. And that length will actually be the number of characters in there. If I comment this out and I run this, notice that we're getting a unhandled exception there. So a string is handled a little bit differently with the null value than other variables, but you can, assuming that there is a nullable type which is supported for that, you can put a question mark there for almost any of the nullable types.